Hi, thanks so much for the introductions and the kind words, and thanks, Minister, for your sharp analysis of the current challenges that you face here in South Australia at the moment. And I think the word that the Minister used was complexity, and that whole idea that the stuff we're going to talk about for the rest of the day is sometimes infuriatingly complex and complicated. But it's our professional responsibility to try and understand that complexity and try and navigate a courageous way through it. And if there's in any way that we can help you and the lead story can help you, then please take that opportunity. And the materials, the information that we've got is all available for you to use. We're not precious about it in that sense. But here's the deal, I suppose. You're going to listen to me rant for a short period of time, roughly about an hour or so, and then you're going to think, and then you're going to come up with some solutions for the rest of the day. And we're going to go through those 3 workshops as was alluded to earlier on. And it is really important that you engage in that process. I'd encourage you just to listen to the story, take from it what you think might be applicable, and then you understand what's happening in South Australia now. So it's going to be your brains that are going to work through the rest of the day and come up with some ideas to move things forward. So please engage in that. Thanks also to Junction Australia and Together South Australia for the invitation. What Graham forgot to mention when he was doing this introduction is that he has stalked me for about a year now, and when it reached the point that he blocked my email account with the amount of emails I was receiving, I felt I had to come out here. So thanks, Graham, for that. Okay, let's see how we get on in terms of talking about the lead story. I'll just make sure. Could you just pass that cup of water up that I have there? The flight over, the flight over was fantastic. It just takes a long time. He didn't quite tell me how far it was when he was talking to me, and what the flight does to your throat. But never mind. And he keeps threatening me with the great wines that are here, but I've not seen any of that yet. So. But never mind, we'll get there. We'll get there in the end. So let me take you through the lead story and try and put it in. But first of all, I want to take you and put it in some sort of context. And this is a context that I think is going to be quite important to you. And I'd ask you to think about this context and then make it applicable to your experiences and the way that you approach your work. And the work that you do is so important, okay? So just think about it in terms of that context. So there's a picture on my fridge, and there is a picture on my fridge, and here it is. And the picture I want you to look at is the picture in the top right-hand corner. Yeah, the top right-hand corner of the children up in the top right-hand corner here. Because the children there it's in a small little village in Ivory Coast. It's just outside a place called Abidjan. It's called a Bobo. And the young person I'd ask you to look at is the little girl in the middle with her hair tied up. And that's a little girl called Jolie. And Jolie is the sister of Victoria Climbié. And I was fortunate enough a number of years ago to be involved with Lord Laming on the Victoria Climbié inquiry in the UK, which was a significant public inquiry into the awful death and murder and torture of Victoria Climbié. And Victoria came from Ivory Coast, from the little place called the Bobo. And she came, as was the norm amongst the families. She was chosen because she was a bright, intelligent little girl, and she left Ivory Coast with a family member in search of an education. And the idea was to get an education, and then you go back to your family and you invest something back into the growth of that particular area. As we know now, that never happened in terms of Victoria's story. And she was her great aunt, who was masquerading as her mother, Marie-Thérèse Quau, when she finally got to London via Paris, and she met up with a bus driver called Carl John Manning. Victoria sadly ended up beaten and tortured and ended up in a bin bag in the bath at 267 Somerset Gardens. And that led to a public outrage, it led to a public inquiry, and part of that public inquiry, I won't go through the details and the horror of that inquiry, but there's a huge amount that you can learn from the public inquiry. I mean, the number of marks on Victoria's body was astronomical. The senior pathologist said it was the worst case that he'd ever seen, and probably the worst case of child abuse that he'd ever come across at all. But put all that to one side, even though there's a huge amount of learning in Victoria's story, which I'll keep referring back to. But I had the opportunity during the inquiry to meet with Victoria's parents, and they travelled from Ivory Coast to try and understand what had happened. You know, their daughter had been in search of a better education from the UK, and it never happened. And what they taught me about not only their humility and integrity in dealing with something as awful as the murder of a child, but what they taught me about the notion of family and the importance of family, and family as an untapped resource. Because what I found out after the inquiry, because I remain in contact with Victoria's family, and we did some work together, because their aspiration was to have a school in Abobo named after Victoria Climbié. Because the theory was quite straightforward in terms of outcomes, in terms of results. Had there been a school in Abobo in Ivory Coast, Victoria would be alive today. And we've helped them. We've helped them work with them, and they've done most of the work, but we helped them. And there is now a school in Abobo, the Victoria Climbié School in Ivory Coast, and we work with businesses when I was Director of Children's Services in Hull, and businesses in Leeds as well to help generate money. And Victoria's mum came over to Hull. That's I look a bit younger there, don't I? But that was many years ago. That was outside Hull Station, and just if you think about that, the city of Hull in the UK, and there's the school behind the photograph that's on my fridge. You can see the start of the school being built there. But what I learned was, back in Ivory Coast, there was a huge untapped resource waiting that would have helped Victoria, called family, and family in its broadest definition, family spreading across community, and within all those connections and relationships, people who care enough to do something to help a child when there are some of those conditions of adversity that the minister talked about earlier on. But not one person in the UK knew anything about that at all, even though Victoria was known to a number of social services agencies, a number of police departments, 2 major hospitals, and the NSPCC. So nobody knew anything about that. And that just brings about the question of why is that? And what is it in when we're responding to the sort of volume of referrals the minister referred to, that we don't actually seek out the full picture of what's available to help? What's available to help? So I'd ask you to think about Victoria's story. I think about Victoria every single day. And I got a WhatsApp this morning I've got 4 boys, and Tom, you better watch out because he's on his way to Adelaide actually. So Tom has been in Canada, and he's traveling Canada. He's been doing the ski slopes, and he's just making enough money to have a great time. Every now and again we get a phone call asking for money, but that's how it works, I gather. He's met a girl from Australia, and they're now, I got a text this morning, he's in Hawaii, and they're on their way to Australia. So I know everything about Tom's hopes and his dreams and his aspirations. Tom was born the same year as Victoria. That's why Victoria's story is so important to me personally as well. But I'd ask you to think about it, because if you look at the public inquiry, and I'm just thinking about the commission that you're dealing with now, and the 200 and a lot recommendations that are in that commission. In Lord Laming's report, there was 128 recommendations. But actually, you can crystallise it down to these 3 statements. These 3 statements. And as we go through the conversation today, and as I take you through the lead story, just think about these 3 things, okay? So this idea of doing the simple things better, because in Victoria's case, the simple things weren't done at all, let alone better. And it's the simple things that make the biggest difference to the lives of children. The simple things that you do every day. Answering the phone, filling the file in, turning up when you say you're going to turn up. The simple things make the biggest difference to the lives of children. Now, one of the things we have, one of the problems we faced in Leeds, and as I was saying last night, I've no doubt that this doesn't exist at all in any of your work or in Adelaide or in South Australia. We have a fantastic ability in the UK to take a simple idea and make it insanely complicated. And we put a layer on top of a layer on top of a layer. Now, you won't have that problem, but those are the sort of things that you need to think about, is how do we take the complexity of the work, as the minister said, that you're dealing with? Because it is complicated, but make it as simple as possible. Einstein once said, and I'll misquote him, but he said something along the lines of, we have a responsibility to make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. No simpler. And what he means is, don't ignore the complexity of what it is you're dealing with, but make it simple enough that everybody can understand it. And he also says something along the lines, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So think about that as we get into these conversations today. The second one is the child is the client. So Director of Children's Services, the Children Act, the clues in the title that we're here for children and to respond to the needs of children. Yet how many times, how many cases that go wrong, how many public inquiries, how many serious case reviews, using the language that we would use in the UK, do you read where we've listened to the adult's story, the adult's version of events, and we've not listened to the voice of the child? Victoria was never hidden. She was never hidden. She was always on show. People could always see her until very near the end of her life. But Marie-Therese Quao was always the voice. She was always the person who told the story, who explained, who spoke for Victoria, etc. We've got a professional responsibility to be respectful of the adults in a child's life and listen to their version of events, but your professional responsibility is to the child. The child is the client. That's why you're in the jobs that you're in. You must always work doubly hard to make sure you hear the voice of the child. And then the final one, in the legislation in the UK, there is a duty. And if there's any lawyers in the room, lawyers like duties because it's pretty clear. And the duty is, and it's a collective duty, to safeguard and promote the welfare of the child. And people often forget that, and when you ask people what are they about to do when they're intervening in the life of a child, what are they thinking about, then they often find it hard to explain how what they're about to do is going to actually help safeguard and promote the welfare of that particular child. The challenge is, if you can't simply explain how by doing this it's going to help safeguard and promote the welfare of this child or those children or these families, then stop doing it, take a step back and think again. If you can explain it simply, probably do more of it. Do more of it. But that duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of the child is something that should bind everybody together. So I just ask you to think about those three things as we move forward. This is a quote we've used. On the Leeds journey, I worked very closely with a senior politician at the time, Deputy Leader of the Council, Councillor Judith Blake, and we used to have a little bit of an argument that she loved this book, Howard's End, E.M. Forster. I thought it was a dreadfully dull book, but we both, no offence to any English scholars out there, but we both agreed that the quote, "Only connect," was fantastic. And that idea that it's connections, relationships and conversations that help safeguard children. We talk too much, we have to, but we talk too much about systems, processes and regulations. You've got to talk about and think about more about those connections, relationships and conversations. Those are the things, that's how people safeguard children at the end of the day. Further in the quote it says, live in fragments no longer. So that separation, those different agencies that the minister referred to that all have a role to play. Whatever the structural framework is, it doesn't matter. They've got to have a set of relationships and connections that work to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. Okay? So those are things for you to think about. And the reason that connections, conversations and relationships are so important is because of this. Everything is simple. It's people who complicate things. And it's those relationships that start to get in the way if you don't invest in them, if you don't invest in having the right conversations, if you don't invest in making the right connections around the life of that child or those children that you're working with. So I'd ask you to think about that. But probably the most important picture I'm going to show you today, this is our first grandchild. This is Violet. This is 2 years ago now. Where's that time gone? And already she was asking the right questions, as you can see. Now, Violet, being 2, has reached the age where, although I would strongly argue that it's the behaviour of adults that has the biggest impact on the behaviour of children, watching Violet grow up, her ability to manipulate the behaviour of the adults around her is phenomenal. And the latest thing, so Violet was 2 a couple of months ago, and the latest thing is she likes to pull a scary face, what she calls her scary face, because she likes to see the reaction that everybody gives. So when I told her I was coming here and we were explaining to her where it was, she wanted to send you one of her special scary faces. Okay, so here you go. And that's exactly the reaction she wants to hear about. So she'll be very pleased with that. But also from when I told colleagues in Leeds that I was coming here, and you'll see some of the activity on Twitter, they wanted to send you a message as well. So with a fair wind, there's a message from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
We are very ambitious in Leeds. We want to be the best city in the UK. To be the best city in the UK, we have to be the best city for children and young people growing up. That is at the heart of our ambition, to be a child-friendly city.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds. Leeds.
One thing that we're really challenged with and will deliver on is a Leeds being a child-friendly city.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds. Hello from Leeds. Hello from Leeds. Hello from Leeds.
Okay, Councillor Judith Blake, who you saw on the film there, was the deputy leader then. She's now the leader of the council. So in terms of the sustainability of our child-friendly Leeds ambitions, I just need to keep reminding her, and we continue to move things forward. So important stuff. So that's the message from Leeds. This is where we were in July 2009. An inspector calls. We've got an organisation called Ofsted, which is a very big inspectoral regulation arm of government, and it inspects every single local authority in the country. Everybody loves to wait for the phone call to know they're going to get their unannounced inspection, and Leeds fell over on that inspection and got the message that it didn't want to hear, that it was not aware of, that it was failing to safeguard the well-being of children within the city of Leeds. That caused all sorts of mayhem, politically, operationally, media-wise, children, families, public, just the general perception of Leeds. Even though in places who get that sort of news where things go badly wrong, there's good stuff going on. There's people trying their best to do the right things. It has a massive negative effect across the organisation. So that's where we were. I was fortunate enough to be appointed as the Director of Children's Services, working with Councillor Judith Blake in 2010. And the ambition was, first of all, was to just sort it. Just what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of this? And you've got two choices, in my view. You can repair things, you can sort of make things a bit better and try and put things right, or you can have a level of ambition where you genuinely try to transform the life chances of the next generation. And that's a choice, and that might be something you want to think about here. My sense is that you don't want to just repair things here. You want to do something more ambitious and take the opportunity out of adversity and move some significant steps forward. So in that conversation we had about what if, so how ambitious do we want to be, it was all predicated on one question. What's it like to be a child or young person growing up in Leeds today? What's it like? Because it's different. It's different for different children in different sets of circumstances. Leeds is a big place, not quite as big as South Australia, but it's a big place. And it's different in different parts of Leeds. And then it's different again for different children in those different parts of Leeds. If you think about this idea of child, carer, context, the context is all important in terms of everybody's different circumstances. And again, we have a professional responsibility to try and answer this question. And to use the information at your disposal to answer this question, what's it like? Because if you understand what it's like, then you can start to support the positive and respond to the negative. If you don't understand what it's like, you're responding to processes and systems and procedures. Okay? Because the second part of the question is, and how do we make it better? How do we make it better? That relentless focus on making things better, which should be never ending. Should be never ending. You should never be satisfied where you get to work. The moment we turn around in Leeds and say, that's it, done that, we're a child-friendly city, we know we're wrong. We'll never. It's got to be an ambition that you continue to pursue. And I'd ask you to think about this as well, this sort of idea, the social fabric of places, the social fabric of geographical areas, of cities, and this idea that children live in families. It's how society works. Now, family will mean different things to different people. There's some commentators talk about the death of the family. Well, actually, it's not the death of the family. It's just different. It means different things to different people in different contexts. But those families create communities, and those communities create cities, or geographical areas, or places, however you want to describe it. And those relationships are often forgotten at the expense of the physical regeneration of a place. So the overemphasis on the physical growth of places forgets the social growth of places. So if you think about physical regeneration, our argument would be you need to match it with social regeneration at exactly the same time. Because if you invest in the social regeneration, the physical regeneration will work and it will become sustainable in the long term. If you don't, it might look better, but it has the potential to fall over economically as things move forward. So that was one of the ideas. And we also recognise there's a whole load of context to growing up in the UK. You'll have the equivalent of this information for South Australia. You'll have more data than is healthy for you, I can assure you. But you'll have this information. And you need to understand, in answering the question, what's it like to be a child or young person growing up in South Australia, what the changing nature is. So this idea of the changing nature of families. And these are facts. This is evidence-based stuff, okay? And it's important to understand it. You need to also understand there will be hard evidence on what we call family risk factors. Now, these are the things that are not causal. They're not causal, so it doesn't mean if you tick all these boxes you're in real big trouble and your life chances are compromised. But what it means is the chances of poor outcomes increase. It increases the chance. If these things come together in unhelpful ways, then these risk factors are not helpful in terms of your long-term outcomes. But you need to understand what that pattern looks like across South Australia, and I think you'll have that evidence from what I've heard so far. Because there's also risk to young people. These are the things that can compromise the life chances and the outcomes for young people as they grow up. Leaving school with no qualifications, involvement in crime, alcohol and drugs, poor mental health, homelessness, pregnancy and fatherhood. We know this. These are facts. These are things that you're dealing with day in, day out in your work. But we also know there's some good news. Whatever else goes on, somehow or other, there's a set of protective factors that helpfully come together and wrap themselves around the lives of children, even in conditions of extreme adversity, and kids do okay. kids do okay. You think of any of the projects you work in, any of the services you're involved in, any of the schemes you're involved in, any of the initiatives you're involved in that you're proud of and that work. I bet a reasonable amount of money there'll be one or more of the factors on here that are part and parcel of what it is you're doing. Minister referred to children's centres. Children's centres in Leeds, we've got 52 of them across the city. They've been the bread and butter part of that offer to the community to guarantee children the best start in life. And that this list is what they do. It's just what they do, day in, day out. So I'd ask you to think a little bit more about those protective factors. Or put another way, it's how children grow up. Experience of education system, the labour market, the society and culture which they grow up in, relationships with parents and families, experiences with peers, and in leisure time. Important things to think about. So we looked at all this stuff, and then we started to have a set of what we call what-if conversations. What-if conversations. What if we could do things slightly differently? And what these three probably catch most of it. What if it became an organisational imperative to make this work, to actually do something disproportionately off the scale in terms of how we looked at children and young people? What if we started to mobilise more than just the usual suspects and started to push this idea forward of children at the heart of a growth strategy of the city? What if that became something that we could really mobilise a lot of people behind? What if we started to explore the relationship between the state, us as an expression of the state, and local citizens, and negotiated a new social contract about the relationship between the two, about how the state works with children, young people and their families, and local communities? What if we started to think differently about family? And what if we thought about family? Because you'll hear a lot, particularly when we started this work in Leeds, and Leeds was a growing city. The chief executive of Leeds at the time, who's been hugely supportive of this initiative, as with most chief executives, was embroiled in lots of talk about superfast broadband, new transport systems, new businesses coming into that physical regeneration, the physical infrastructure of place. When we were talking about, well, what if we match that with a social infrastructure? And what if we prioritise family as the most important, however you define family, the most important, but the most neglected, the most underinvested in, the most least recognised utility of the 21st century? Just think about that for a moment. If you started to invest properly in that social fabric of how children grow up, what difference could you make to the future of children? Which then meant we had to have a plan. We had to think outside the box and start to come up with a plan, because all these what-if conversations we were having around the city were starting to have traction. And that took us to some advice from Spike Milligan, which was very tempting, that you should never plan anything, because nothing can then ever go wrong. And there were moments when that became very attractive. But we went back to a plan, and the plan was this idea of Leeds. What if Leeds became the world's first child-friendly city? And it is predicated on the work that UNICEF have done on child-friendly cities, and I know there's some of that activity going on here in South Australia. But it was actually different. We had a lot of conversations with UNICEF, and we wanted to move a little bit further away from the UNICEF model. And if you look at the UNICEF model worldwide, it never really catches an entire place. You'll have initiatives like in the third world, you'll have access to clean water, sanitation, education. In the UK, London probably did more than anybody else on play and free transport for children. But the totality, the centrality of children to the growth strategy of an area, there isn't anywhere that had, in our experience, that had managed to do that. And so this idea of Leeds becoming the world's first child-friendly city, and it's not just this idea of let's all be nice to children, because why wouldn't you want to be nice to children? It was the hard-nosed economic regeneration strategy. And by articulating it in that way, it opened up a set of conversations across the city with people that we didn't even think would be interested in that conversation. But when they understood it in those terms about the growth strategy of a place, they wanted to be involved in it, and they found ways that they could start to be involved in it. So this was the plan, the original plan. At the time, there were 180,000 children and young people across the city of Leeds. We had one vision for Leeds to be a child-friendly city. There was one partnership which was chaired by Councillor Judith Blake, so a senior politician, with the great and the good around the table. One place in Leeds where there is a high-level conversation about children in the city. One place where that conversation takes place. One partnership that supported, so that whole partnership then supported things together at that point. One plan, which is a very simple plan, which I think you've either got copies of now or you'll be getting copies of later on. We'll come back to that in a moment. And it had 5 outcomes. 5 outcomes in the Children and Young People's Plan. It's a very thin document. It's a one plan on a page. 5 outcomes, and the idea of 5 outcomes was because it gets too complicated for me if I go off one hand and I then have to have 2 hands holding up. So 5 outcomes. 5, and when I say outcome, I'd ask you to think about this. So the outcomes are conditions of well-being that you want for all children. A condition of well-being, okay? And an outcome should be a condition of well-being that you can express as a sentence, because then it's simple enough for people to understand. So all children and young people in Leeds are safe from harm. All children and young people in Leeds make healthy lifestyle choices. All children and young people in Leeds do well in learning and have skills for life. All children and young people in Leeds have fun growing up. They enjoy their childhood. All children and young people in Leeds are active citizens who feel they have a genuine voice, and that voice has an influence. And that's it. It's just those 5 things. And they were signed off politically, they were signed off operationally, they were signed off with the conversations around the city with children, young people and families themselves, and we stuck to those 5 things. And everything that everybody was doing around the city of Leeds should lead back to one or more of those population-based outcomes. And I'd urge you to think about what are your 5 or your 6 or your 7. What are the things that are going to bind you together? Maybe we can do a bit of thinking about that later on. Because what that did, it started to change the nature of the conversations that we had, away from what are social services doing, what are children's services doing, what are the police doing, what are health doing, what are education doing, what are the third sector doing, to what are we all doing to make a difference to one or more of these 5 outcomes. And then we locked ourselves in a shed with all the data that we've got, and it's way too much, and took a conscious decision that, look, what's the point of trying to boil the ocean? What's the point of us trying to do everything for everybody all the time? Because you're just never going to do it, and you're never going to manage in that way. We've got to have something that means we can have a bit more of an acute focus on what we're going to do to improve these 5 outcomes. So we picked 12 things that Leeds wasn't doing very well at. And given where we were with the Ofsted inspection. So things that weren't going so well in educational attainment, things that weren't going so well in terms of health outcomes for young people, things that weren't going so well in terms of social care, youth crime, usual suspects, I suppose, in many respects. And if we went through that exercise again now, we'd probably come up with a very similar list. But just pick the 12 and say, let's prioritize those. Doesn't mean everything else stops. Doesn't mean everything else stops, but you've got a disproportionate focus on a smaller number that becomes more manageable. It means you can actually start to mobilize things behind it. But then we took it a step further, and we said, well, if we've got 12, what if we only had 3? What if we only picked 3 things, and we were going to disproportionately obsess on these 3 things as a city? Could we move? Could we turn the curve? Could we change the patterns around those 3 things? And those 3 things were to safely and appropriately reduce the need for children to be looked after by the state. I think what you would call out-of-home care, the Minister referred to earlier on. Leeds had too many, and too many where we weren't confident all the alternatives had been explored thoroughly. So too many kids looked after by the state, huge expense, poor outcomes as those kids grow up. What would it take to turn the curve and have more children safely and appropriately grown up in their own family network? Second one, school attendance. When I arrived in Leeds and we were having these conversations, people said to me, you don't have to worry about school attendance, it's okay, it's 90-odd%. When we looked at it, the 90-odd% was 92%. And when you looked at the school-age population in Leeds, what it means is 92% means that on any one school day in Leeds, there are around 8,000 children not in school. You think, is that okay? Are we okay with that? No, we're not okay with that. Now, a significant proportion might have legitimate reasons to not be in school, but in that 8,000, you had those more vulnerable kids who were running the risk of becoming invisible. And education is an entitlement. It's how we want children to grow up, part of that community network that we were talking about earlier on. If children aren't accessing their entitlement, then that's going to compromise their outcomes in the future. It's part of what is it like to be a child or young person growing up in Leeds today. So what could we do about school attendance? And the third one was destinations. When young people leave their schooling, where do they go? What happens? And what we found was we had a disproportionately high number of young people who left school and then were not in education, not in employment, and not in training. They were doing nothing. An ugly title we have called NEETs in the UK. So are we happy with that? No, we're not happy with that. You've grown up, you've gone through your entire learning opportunities, and you're doing nothing. What does that do to the economic growth of a city? That's something we need to worry about. So what can we do with those three things? And here's the interesting thing. When you looked at and we like a good list in Leeds, by the way, you get a good list of names and addresses. Who are the kids that are looked after by the state? Who are the kids that are not in school? Who are the kids that are not in education, employment or training? Surprise, surprise, it's the same kids. It's the same kids. The most vulnerable ones are, if you're looked after by the state, you're more likely to have poor school attendance. If you've got poor school attendance, you're more likely to finish school with no qualifications, therefore be not in education, employment or training. And you'll know this. You'll know this in terms of the young people, children and young people you're working with. So what could we do about those three obsessions? We then needed an architecture to hold the whole thing together. You've got to have shape. I would say don't over worry about it, but just put, and sometimes we do over worry about structural change, but it's the relationships within the structure that make the biggest difference. So think about the shape, and that's the shape in Leeds. It's held centrally at that top table, and then it's pushed down into what we call 25 clusters. And clusters are local iterations of that centrally held body. So multi-agency partnerships in geographies that make sense to local people and professionals, usually wrapped around secondary education provision, partner primary schools, health provision, third sector, police, etc., etc., etc. So you've got a mini, what we would call a Children's Trust Board, a mini one in each of those 25 localities, because it's different for different children across each of those 25, but it's held together against the one vision, the 5 outcomes, the 12 priorities and the 3 obsessions, and the data and the information flows down to the 25 and it flows back up again. And the deal is, whatever else you do in your cluster, in each of those 25 clusters, you'll talk about the 3 obsessions, the 12 priorities, and the 5 outcomes as the data plays into the children and young people that live in your area. Okay? And then so you get the citywide data and you get the local data. And we invested in 3 behaviours, 3 explicitly. Anybody who wanted to work in the Children's Services Partnership in Leeds, there's an explicit commitment to 3 types of behaviour. The first is outcome-based accountability, or what you would call over here results-based accountability. A simple way of problem solving and a simple way of performance management, if you want to use the jargon. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anybody any better off? Have we made a blind bit of difference? And just getting the discipline of the simplicity of that into all those conversations across the city helped us move things forward enormously, rather than big, fangled, complicated performance management systems and problem-solving systems. An investment in something that we would call restorative practices. You may be familiar with the idea of restorative justice, the idea where something goes wrong, a crime's committed, and then there's a sort of mediation process to try and resolve that conflict and repair the harm that's been done. What if you could take those ideas of restorative justice and turn it into restorative practices where you create the conditions where things are less likely to go wrong in the first place? And the basic premise of that is that we do things with people, not doing things to people, not doing things for people, or worst of all, not doing anything at all, in a set of conditions around high support and high challenge. the entire legislation the entire regulation and guidance in the UK and the entire mindset in the UK, and in particular in Leeds, in child protection, was geared towards doing things to families, do this or else, or doing things for families, don't worry, we'll sort it out for you, as opposed, or doing nothing at all, you don't meet our criteria, you don't meet the referral pattern, as opposed to high support, high challenge, doing things with families. So explicit, and that's as much about our behaviour as leaders and managers and professionals as it is about how we behave with families and those communications on the front line. And the third behaviour was a recognition that talking to, listening to, and responding to children is a skill. And some of our staff were stunningly brilliant at that, and some of our staff were not. And how do you get more people skilled with listening to the voice of the child? So the voice and influence of children at the heart in terms of those behaviours. Conscious decision to put schools at the heart of those local communities, as the heartbeat of a local community, because that's how children grow up. And we thought, just on a rough calculation at the time, there's at least, in a city the size of Leeds, at least 75,000 people who day in, day out touch the lives of the 180,000 children and young people. What if we could mobilise 75,000 people behind this plan and this way of working with our ambition for Leeds to be a child-friendly city? What difference could we make to the life chances of the next generation? And a theme running throughout all the work in Leeds, because of that economic push, was a life ready for learning. A life ready for learning. So it extended beyond children and young people, but it started in the very early years, the first 2 years of a child's life, where you have to invest significantly, and then you've got a fighting chance of improving outcomes into adulthood. So that idea of a life. So that's it. That's the plan. There you are. Thank you very much. Finished. No, that's the plan. And that's what I'd ask you to think about. As we move forward, mobilising the idea of a child-friendly city, we started to do a number of things. Now, Graham insisted I put this slide up. It's One Direction, one of his favourite bands. And this is, don't know why he did that, but he's adamant. All the email, 90% of the emails I get from him about One Direction. This idea was, when you have, and we put a brand together around child-friendly Leeds, anybody who visits Leeds who's reasonably well known, we talk them into giving us a photo or a little video clip or a message supporting child-friendly Leeds. Because for some reason, known only to themselves, young people are much more likely to listen to this crew than they are to us on the front line. So it's just another way of starting to mobilise that collective effort. I mentioned earlier on the three behaviours, really critical. Most plans will tend to have the strategy and the priorities, but it's the human interaction, it's the human behaviour that sits behind it, because the human behaviour will create the culture of the organisation or organisations or the place that you're working in. So I'd urge you to think about that. There's Dizzy Rascal when he was in Leeds as well. And we had a strong political commitment to this. A strong political commitment. So this was Councillor Blake. The default behaviour of Children's Services in Leeds, all its dealings with local citizens, partners, organisations, will be a restorative one. High support with high challenge. Fundamentally challenging the orthodoxy of what we'd experienced over the previous life of Leeds' story in terms of child welfare and why it failed. Fundamental challenge, but with strong political support. This was one of the 2-year birthday celebrations of Child Friendly Leeds. And we set about, with that remit, of trying to change the culture. And this idea that don't underestimate the importance of the culture of the organisation that you create, or the culture of the place that you create. And that's how you can start. If you start to get under the skin of that, you can start to create momentum. Cross-party political support. Using outcome-based accountability as a recognised methodology for all projects across the city. That approach adopted by key citywide strategic partnerships. The Children's Trust Board received regular outcome-based accountability reports. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anybody any better off? On the simplicity of the plan. All the cluster arrangements use it in the same way. So what you're trying to create is a common language where everybody, you've taken the complex. And this performance measurement idea, if you want to use that language, is insanely complicated, as you know, and you've probably got reports coming out your ears, and try and simplify it. Well, what if we did this? What if we behaved in this way and we use this? We can start to talk to each other in ways that are a lot easier. And at the bottom there's something called the Top 100 methodology, this idea of getting away from referral wars, or threshold wars, as we call it. We banned the word threshold, actually. We banned target and we banned thresholds, because both instill a culture that encourages bad behaviour, if I'm honest. People game the thresholds, people game the targets to make sure that they've met them. And what was happening with thresholds was there'd be arguments between one professional group and another professional group, usually, I don't know, education as an example, trying to refer into children's social care, and an argument about meeting the threshold criteria. And you'd have the educationalist saying, look, I'm really worried about this kid, what do I have to do to get a social worker out of the office? Oh, you don't meet our threshold, sorry, it doesn't meet the criteria. Being slightly disingenuous, but that's the basis of it. So what does the head teacher do? Head teacher goes away and learns how to press the right buttons to get past that referral criteria. So the language changes, they start mentioning drugs, alcohol, I think there's violence, I think I've seen a bruise, and those sort of things mean somebody's got to go out. And it works the other way around between health and between social workers. If you're in the receiving team where you do the assessment and investigation, and then you pass it over to a case management team, you have the same arguments between those two. Any point where there is a referral point into something that is a limited resource, you get into those threshold wars. And we tried to get rid of that and increase the number of conversations. So the Top 100 methodology was saying, okay, if people in this cluster are worried about children, everybody sit round the table and everybody bring their top 10. Who are the kids, the 10 kids that you are most worried about, the 10 families you're most worried about? So, okay, head teacher, who's your 10? Social worker, who's your 10? Police officer, who's your 10? Health professional, your 10? Third sector partner, who's your 10? And surprise, surprise, it's the same kids. And you soon get to your 100. And then the conversation is not about who we're going to work with, it's what we're going to do and who's best placed to do what. And when you do something, that work carries on, and then you top up your list. You top up your list. So any one day in Leeds, there'll be 25 clusters, 2,500 of the most vulnerable families in Leeds, identified by the professional network, being dealt with, hopefully in a constructive way. Okay, this is the Child Friendly Leeds Choir on one of the visits to the city. Restorative commitment to working with individuals was part of the change in the culture, massive influence. OBA used in areas that we've never used it before, around planning for school places, which used to be very heated community-based conversations, but has helped us navigate our way around that. Social care transformation program, the new social contract with families, and trying to get to that position where this is just how we work. This is the way we do things around here. And that's the bit where you know you've started to change the culture. So, big question then is anybody any better off? And it's not an unreasonable challenge. If you're going to set yourself up with Child Friendly Leeds as an ambition, here's the plan, this is what we want to do. So the legitimate question is, well, so what? So what? What's actually changed? So, on the 3 obsessions, this is where we were. This is where we were heading in terms of the number of children that were looked after by the state. This is where we've gone. That's what it means. £16 million saved, and it continues to go down to this day. This is where we were on destinations, young people not in education, employment or training. This is where we were heading. A bit more of a bumpy ride, but again, nearly 600 young people who are no longer neat, to use the horrible phrase. School attendance, this is the one we couldn't shift, remember? We didn't have to worry about primary schools, secondary schools. This is where we were. This is where we've gone. Now think about this. What that means, although the graph's gone up, and it's in one sense small percentages in the way that that curve's turned, what that equates to is approximately 400,000 additional school days taken up by the children of Leeds. What does that do to the life chances of the next generation? We monitor this with something that I refer to as the Thing of Beauty. So this comes out every week, and it's called the Thing of Beauty because it took forever, with some work from a colleague of mine called Mike Pinnock, for us to get the data people to be calm enough to release data weekly when it's not been vetted and it's not been released nationally and it's not gone through this, that and the other. Because actually, it doesn't matter. The trigger of this is to generate the right conversations amongst the right people. So this Thing of Beauty goes out every week, and there's a top table conversation about what's it doing, and then it goes down to the 25 clusters and they get their own individual version of what's happening. Who's looked after? How many kids are looked after? How many kids are not in school at the moment? How many kids are neat? Right, who are they? Where are they? Who's best placed to do what we're going to do? And it just triggers those conversations. So in a way, although it's particularly beautiful when it's green, it doesn't matter what colour it is. It's to trigger the right conversations. And easy access to that sort of data is critical, is absolutely critical to generating the right conversation. Because you can't argue about it, it's just there. It's just there. Whereas if you haven't got it, you're at the mercy of anecdote. A myth and rumour and people's interpretation of what might or might not be happening. Okay, this is the city when, in terms of child-friendly Leeds, where we dress the city. We dress the city in terms of when kids are taking exams, so good luck in your exams, and then when the results come out, they have the well done in your exams. Just a message, because it's horrible time for kids, is to say the city cares, the city's interested. What you're about to do is really important to the growth strategy of the city. The inspectors came back, they gave us good across the board, and they gave us outstanding for leadership and management. That was a huge day. They were with us for 4.5 weeks. They brought extra inspectors in. I think given the size of Leeds and where we'd been previously, they couldn't quite understand it. They said 2 things to us. One, remarkable and impressive in terms of the journey, but secondly, and the most important, I think, none of this is built on sand. None of this is built on sand. And what that meant was when they went round the city and talked to everybody, they weren't bumping into people going, I've written it down here. Nigel told me to say there's 5 outcomes, and it was actually, this is just what we do. This is how we work. This is how we operate. So that was really important. They mentioned, I mentioned outcome-based accountability, and I asked you to think about this later on in the workshops, but this idea of results-based accountability helped us massively change the culture of the organisation, and Ofsted picked that up. So you might want to think about that. But here's just another message from children from Leeds. That's Nicola Adams. That's coming up next.
Senior leaders and councillors have a passion to get things right for all children.
Success and achievement is celebrated, and there is a good evidence of children and young people's influence on political decision making.
Professionals across the city put children and young people at the heart of their work.
Children's services in Leeds benefit from outstanding, inspirational and confident operational and political leadership.
Leeds is creating an environment where good quality social work can flourish.
The priority for Leeds to be a child-friendly city puts children at the heart of any action taken.
Partners work effectively together to safeguard children and young people.
Families get help very quickly, and that means small problems can usually be sorted out before they become big problems. Children and young people are spending more days in school, with attendance improving every year.
Staff take the right action quickly when there is a risk of a child being unsafe.
Children and young people are cared for in their immediate or extended family wherever possible.
and young people have a disability. A good understanding of the young person's needs creates an opportunity for trusting relationships to develop and transfer into adult services.
Children and young people live in safe, stable and appropriate homes.
Social workers talked with pride about the children they worked with.
When children need to be adopted, this happens quickly.
Adoption is considered early as an option for children and young people who might be taken into care.
All the adopters that inspectors spoke with rated the service highly and would recommend it.
Care leavers are helped to stay where they live until they are ready to move on, and they get good support when they set up or go to university.
Social workers and personal advisors for care leavers listen well and get the right help quickly. Young people leaving care are well supported by tenacious staff.
Leeds is good. Leeds is good.
Leeds is good.
Leeds is
Okay, so Leeds is good. And we are still the only core city to be rated good by Ofsted. And that just has a huge impact on morale and on public perception and everything else that moves with it. This is Nicola Adams, one of our Child Friendly Leeds ambassadors, Olympic gold medalist, great role model for women and girls across the city. She's working on the take-up of free school meals with us. I'm going to borrow about 10 minutes more time before Natalie comes and rugby tackles me off the stage. But there's a couple of things I just want to take you through to think about in the future. Is that okay? We okay time-wise? So stick with me. These are things to think about as we go through the rest of the day. Early start and early help, as early in the life of the child as possible, as early in the life of the problem as possible. Okay, those are two big themes in terms of moving forward. The behaviour of adults has the biggest impact on the behaviour of children, unless you're Violet, of course. But think about that. We tend to label the behaviour of children and young people negatively. Yet actually, it's the behaviour of the adults around them that has as much to say about the behaviour of children and young people. Children live in families, which we talked about earlier on. Families create communities, communities create cities. The centrality of families. Families matter. You've got to think about how you're going to make sure families matter. Multi-agency endeavours safeguard children. Nobody can do this on their own. I know you know that. Physical regeneration against social regeneration we've talked about. The commonwealth of an area, the resource that's available that you today are not using and maybe not even aware of. And it's blown our minds over the last 6 years, the sort of resources that have become available to us that we weren't aware of previously. The voice and influence of children, the strength of families. Just mention very quickly this idea of the 90-10. When we looked at our front door, what we would call the front door, so where all the phone calls were coming in, and it was that bombardment rate of this is, all the child protection stuff, all this, we're so busy, we need more, we can't cope, and it was under a huge amount of pressure, and that led to more referrals into social care, which led to more on child protection plans, which led to more in the looked after system. That's the way the system operates. When we looked at it, and we spent a lot of time understanding the nature of the phone calls, and we used video and tape recordings to understand the conversations, 10% consistently is the horrible stuff. It's the broken bone, the battered baby, the sexual assault, the really nasty child protection stuff. And it's a constant 10%. But it's not the majority of the work that you're dealing with. 90% is a massive cocktail, complicated cocktail, as the minister talked about earlier on, of single female carers, drug and alcohol misuse, domestic violence, mental health issues, poverty, poor housing. People struggling to bring up children in conditions of adversity. Yet, everything in Leeds, everything in the UK system at the time was geared towards not missing the 10%. And therefore working out ways of not doing anything with the 90%. And what we've done in Leeds is just flip that round. We want to know the 10%, but by knowing the 90% and doing something about the 90%, you're going to increase your likelihood that you're going to catch the 10%. So it might be worth thinking about that. This is the Leeds Rhinos Super Rugby League team, believe it or not, being trained in restorative practices. And they don't use it on the pitch, but they are great ambassadors for Leeds. Been done a huge amount with us on school attendance, on kinship care, on foster care. Great stuff. Here's some things to think about as we go into the workshops, okay? Keep the complex simple, but not simplistic, I mentioned earlier on. Obsess on outcomes. Outcomes will make the difference for you, will start to change the nature of your relationships and conversations. Keep your discipline. Hold your nerve, I suppose, is another way of expressing that. We haven't changed the Children and Young People's Plan in Leeds in 6 years. In 6 years, we've got a plan and we've stuck to it. There's one slight change to it where the number 12 has now become the number 14 because I was bullied into it, but that's it's not changed. Repeating yourself is good. Understand the patterns. Don't chase targets. Talk about curves and patterns that you're changing. Tell stories. Stories help bring these things to life. Structures help shape behaviours, but relationships make the difference. And of course, repeating yourself is good. This is Ronnie the Rhino, as a Child Friendly Leeds ambassador. And the idea of leadership, we get asked a lot of questions about leadership, and the idea, these are some things to think about. You know, the days of the heroic leadership have gone. You know, that follow me, and then you turn around, nobody's behind you. So that idea is gone. It's about relationships, about how you create the conditions for success, how you foster those relationships across partnerships. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Don't underestimate the power of the culture of an organisation and the way we do things around here. We used to obsess a lot on what we did and how we did it, and we'd forgotten why we were doing it. And I'd ask you to go back to thinking about why you do it. Why do you get out of bed in the morning? Why do you come to work? You come to work to make a difference to the lives of children and young people and families, and put that front and centre. And the idea of leadership is to invert the triangle, where the traditional triangle with the leader at the top and everybody else at the bottom, it flips it. My job as Director of Children's Services is to be at the bottom of the triangle, doing my best to try and create the conditions where people can do the right things. Outcomes. I'm going to borrow 3 more minutes off you, and then one story to finish on. This is everything you need to know about leadership in 3 minutes.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not 2 nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers, because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
There you go. So, two things to finish with. This idea of creating a common language, which gets you better diagnosis of the problems that you're trying to deal with, which gets you better intervention, which leads you to better outcomes. The importance of the common language in terms of trying to mobilize activity around it. We're getting a lot of support around the world now, as you can see. 4 things about we did some work with Professor Satin Brighouse, a famous educationalist in the UK, who's been incredible for us. And he and I came up with, we had four qualities for outstanding leaders: unwarranted optimism, regard crisis as the norm and complexity as fun, an endless supply of intellectual curiosity, and complete absence of paranoia and self-pity. But we did decide that you were allowed complete paranoia and self-pity on the weekend. Okay, so look out for that. And back to Victoria, just to finish. This is where we started. So if you go back to Victoria's story, one of the things I'd ask you to think about, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but there was a particular moment in Victoria's story where she had her second visit to a hospital. Okay, and she went into hospital, and you may have seen some of the story if you can remember it, but when her first hospital visit, she was diagnosed with scabies. Whether or not she had scabies or not is a different issue, but she was taken back to a different hospital, but the second hospital, because allegedly, as an 8-year-old child, she'd poured boiling hot water over her own head to relieve herself from the itching from the scabies treatment. Terrible injuries, and she spent a lot of time in hospital. She spent over 2.5 weeks in hospital. And what we now know about her time in hospital is that she was undoubtedly at her happiest. The staff did an absolutely fantastic job with her. And there's the image of her dancing up and down, dressing up in clothes, pink wellies and a dress, and dancing up and down the ward, and the staff were lovely with her. And then the staff did a beautiful thing for Victoria. They worked out that they couldn't speak her version of French, but they knew there was somebody on the employment roll that did speak that French, and it was a woman called Nurse Taub. And Nurse Taub used to come in on when she was working, but also come in on her days off. And she'd bring Victoria toys and presents, and she'd sit down and she'd befriend Victoria. And we now know that Victoria was probably at her happiest. And it was a fantastic piece of work. But nobody sat down with Nurse Taub and said, "You've got a relationship with Victoria. Could you ask her about this? Could you ask her about the marks on her body? Could you ask her about her family? Could you ask her about a day in the life of Victoria Climbié?" And what would we have found out if that had been the case? Because what happened then is, when Victoria was then asked by the staff and the social workers and the health professionals in the hospital, did she want to go home? Did she want to go home? Then we now know, when Victoria jumped up with a big smile on her face and said yes, Victoria meant home, Ivory Coast, not home 267 Somerset Gardens and in the bin bag, in the bath, and ultimately to her death. That's why this stuff matters. That's why outcomes matter. That's why trying hard is not good enough. And that's why there's a picture on my fridge. Thanks for listening.